A man walked into a VFW post on a Friday evening, ordered a whiskey, and started telling anyone who would listen about the time he jumped out of a C-130 over Afghanistan with nothing but his rifle and his courage. He was loud. He was detailed. He was wearing a set of Airborne wings on his jacket that gleamed like they had never seen a day of service. And for almost 20 minutes, he had the room. Then a 75-year-old man sitting at the end of the bar, quiet, thin, leaning on a cane, turned on his stool and asked one question. One single question about what happens in the door of an aircraft at 1,200 feet. The stranger's mouth opened, but nothing came out, and then every real paratrooper in the room stood up. If you believe that stolen valor should never go unchallenged, type honor in the comments right now, because this story is about the moment a room full of men who earned their wings decided that silence was no longer an option. The VFW post was called Post 4077, and it sat on a 2-lane road about 3 miles outside of Fayetteville, North Carolina, a town that has lived in the shadow and the service of Fort Liberty, formerly Fort Bragg, for as long as anyone can remember. Fayetteville is an airborne town. It is the home of the 82nd Airborne Division, the 18th Airborne Corps, and the United States Army Special Operations Command. The air above that city has been filled with parachutes since 1942, and the ground beneath it has been walked by more paratroopers than perhaps any other piece of earth in America. In a town like that, the airborne wings are not a decoration. They are a covenant. They represent a specific and voluntary act of courage, the decision to step out of a perfectly functioning aircraft into empty air, trusting your training, your equipment, and the man who packed your parachute with your life. Every person who has earned those wings remembers the moment they did. They remember the roar of the engines, the blast of wind, the terrifying and exhilarating instant of freefall, before the canopy opens and the world goes quiet. It is not something you forget. It is not something you fabricate. And it is not something the men and women of Fayetteville take lightly when someone claims it without cause. Post 4077 was a modest building. Single-story, brick and siding, with a gravel parking lot and an American flag that flew 24 hours a day, illuminated at night by a single floodlight that the post commander replaced personally every time it burned out. Inside, it had the warm, worn quality of a place that has been used for its intended purpose for decades. The main room held a bar along one wall, a dozen round tables with mismatched chairs, a pool table with a slight lean to the left, and a wall of photographs that spanned every conflict from Korea to the present day. The photographs were not arranged by date or by unit. They were arranged by the members who had brought them in, each one tacked to the wall with a small brass nameplate underneath. Some of the photographs showed young men in jungle fatigues. Some showed desert camouflage. Some showed dress uniforms and medals and the stiff formal postures of official military portraits. And some, the ones that the regulars looked at the longest, showed groups of soldiers standing in front of aircraft or in drop zones, wearing the same expression that every paratrooper wears after a jump. The dazed, grinning, slightly disbelieving look of someone who has just done something insane and survived. The bartender was a woman named Darlene, 57 years old, heavy-set, with steel grey hair cut short and practical, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanour that comes from spending 30 years married to a Special Forces sergeant and 20 years pouring drinks for the men who served beside him. She knew every regular by name, by drink and by unit. She could spot trouble before it walked through the door, and she had a gift for diffusing it with a look that was worth more than any bouncer. The old veteran arrived at his usual time, 6:15 on a Friday evening, the way he had every Friday for the past 11 years. He came through the door slowly, leaning on a dark wooden cane with a rubber tip that squeaked faintly on the linoleum. He was 75 years old, tall and lean, with short grey hair and a clean-shaven face carved with deep wrinkles and weathered sun-spotted skin. His eyes were sad and weary, with heavy bags underneath that spoke of nights that had not been kind to him in a very long time. He wore a faded dark red cotton shirt, untucked, with the top button open, and a pair of dark trousers that had been pressed with the kind of care that suggested old habits from a life lived in uniform. He did not wear any insignia. He did not wear a hat with a unit patch. He did not wear a jacket with pins or medals or any visible marker of military service. The only thing on his person that might have suggested a connection to the armed forces was the cane itself. If you looked closely, which almost no one ever did, you could see that the handle was carved from a piece of dark walnut in the shape of a parachute canopy, smoothed by years of use until the detail was almost invisible. He sat at his usual spot, the last stool at the far end of the bar near the wall where he could see the entire room without turning his head. Darlene set his drink in front of him without being asked, a single bourbon, neat, in a short glass, and he nodded his thanks. He did not speak to anyone. He rarely did, unless spoken to first. He was a fixture of the post the way the photographs on the wall were fixtures, present, familiar, part of the architecture, and carrying a story that most people in the room knew only in outline. The stranger arrived at approximately 7 o'clock. He came through the front door with the particular energy of a man who expects a room to notice him, and the room did, not because of anything remarkable about his appearance, but because strangers at post 4077 were uncommon enough to draw a glance. He was in his mid-40s, average height, thick-set, with a reddish-brown goatee and a receding hairline that he compensated for with a backward baseball cap. He wore a black leather motorcycle jacket, and on the left breast of the jacket, pinned with what appeared to be a standard military clutchback, was a set of United States Army Airborne wings. The wings were silver and bright, without the patina that comes from years of wear, and they sat on the leather at a slightly crooked angle, as if they had been pinned in front of a mirror by someone who wasn't entirely sure where they were supposed to go. He walked to the bar, took a stool near the centre, and ordered a Jack Daniels on the rocks. Darlene poured it without comment, but her eyes lingered on the wings for a moment longer than they normally would have on a piece of jewellery. She set the drink down, took his money, and moved to the other end of the bar where the old veteran was sitting. She didn't say anything to the old man. She didn't need to. She simply glanced toward the stranger, and then back at him, and the old man's eyes followed her glance and settled on the wings. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked back at his bourbon and took a small sip. His expression did not change. The stranger started talking within 5 minutes of sitting down. He didn't need a prompt. He didn't need an audience. He simply needed an open space and a drink in his hand, and the words came out like water through a broken valve. Fast, pressurized, and impossible to stop once they started. He began by complimenting the post, telling the man on the stool next to him, a 62-year-old retired infantry sergeant named Bill Kehoe, who had done 3 tours in Iraq, that it was great to find a real veteran's bar, not one of those tourist traps. Bill nodded politely and turned back to his beer. The stranger took this as an invitation. He shifted on his stool, angled his body toward Bill, and began to talk about his service. He said he had been in the 82nd Airborne Division. He said he had deployed to Afghanistan in 2003. He said he had made 11 combat jumps. He said this with the confident fluidity of a man who has rehearsed a story so many times that it has taken on the texture of memory, blurring the line between what happened and what he wishes had happened. Bill Kehoe listened without expression. He was a man who had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing you can do with a liar is interrupt him, because interruptions give him a chance to recalibrate. It is far better to let him talk, to let the details accumulate, to let the architecture of the lie become fully visible before you examine its foundation. The stranger's stories grew bolder as his glass emptied. He talked about jumping into a hot drop zone outside Kandahar, taking fire before his feet hit the ground. He talked about a night operation where his team had to navigate through a minefield, using nothing but starlight and instinct. He talked about carrying a wounded squadmate on his back for 3 miles through hostile terrain. Each story was vivid, detailed, and delivered with the practiced cadence of a man who had watched enough war movies and read enough books to construct a narrative that sounded plausible to anyone who had never actually been there. But to anyone who had been there, to anyone who knew what a real combat jump looked like, what a real minefield felt like, what a real wounded man weighed after 3 miles, the stories had the unmistakable quality of fiction. They were too clean, too cinematic, too perfectly structured, with clear beginnings and satisfying endings and none of the ugly, chaotic, incomprehensible mess that actual combat always is. Real war stories don't have act structures. They have gaps. They have moments that don't make sense. They have parts that the teller skips over because the words for those parts do not exist in any language. Several of the regulars had begun to notice. A table near the pool table held 4 men in their 50s and 60s. Carl Mackey, retired Master Sergeant, Airborne qualified, 3 combat jumps in Grenada and Panama. Dwight Odom, retired Staff Sergeant, 82nd Airborne, 22 years of service. Henry Ziegler, retired Sergeant First Class, Pathfinder qualified, 2 tours in Iraq, and Frank Caruso, retired First Sergeant, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 26 years of service, and a Silver Star from Operation Just Cause. These 4 men had been coming to Post 4077 together every Friday night for 8 years. They called themselves the Friday Board, and they took their corner table with the same territorial commitment that paratroopers bring to everything. They had heard the stranger's voice carrying across the room, they had registered the claims, and they had begun the quiet, methodical process that veterans use when they suspect someone is wearing something they didn't earn. They listened, they noted inconsistencies, and they waited. Carl was the first to speak, leaning across the table to Dwight with his voice low enough that only the 4 of them could hear. 11 combat jumps in Afghanistan. We didn't do 11 combat jumps in the entire GWOT. Dwight nodded slowly. And he said he was 82nd. The 82nd made 1 combat jump in Afghanistan, Objective Rhino 2001. 1. If he was there, that's 1 jump. Henry, who was the most even-tempered of the group, held up a hand. Let him talk. Maybe he's confused. Maybe he's mixing up training jumps with combat jumps. Frank looked at him. He's not confused, Henry. He's performing. They went back to their beers and continued to listen. At the end of the bar, the old veteran sat on his stool and sipped his bourbon. He had heard every word. The bar was not large, and the stranger's voice had the carrying power of someone who wanted to be heard. The old man had listened to the claims the way a mechanic listens to an engine, not to the words, but to the sound underneath the words, the rhythm, the hesitations, the places where confidence surged and the places where it faltered. He had heard men tell true war stories. He had told a few himself, on rare occasions, to people who had earned the right to hear them, and he knew, with the bone-deep certainty that comes only from experience, that the man at the centre of the bar had never jumped out of an aircraft, had never felt the blast of prop wash, had never experienced the specific and unforgettable terror of standing in an open door with nothing below you but 1,200 feet of air and the absolute necessity of stepping forward anyway. The old man knew this because truth has a sound and so does its absence. He set his glass down and waited. The stranger had moved on to a new audience. 2 younger men, civilians, mid-30s, in town for a fishing trip, had taken seats at the bar and were listening to his stories with the wide-eyed engagement of people who had never met someone who claimed to have done these things. The stranger was enjoying their attention. He was leaning back on his stool, gesturing broadly, his voice rising with each new detail. He was telling them about a high-altitude, low-opening jump, a halo jump he called it, using the acronym with the casual familiarity of someone who had never earned the right to use it, into a valley surrounded by enemy positions. He described the silence of freefall, the rush of the wind, the moment the chute opened and the world appeared beneath him like a map. The 2 civilians were captivated. One of them asked, "What was the scariest part?" The stranger paused for effect, the pause of a showman, not a soldier, and said, "Knowing that if anything went wrong, there was no one coming to save you." At the Friday board table, Frank Caruso set his beer down and said quietly, "Halo. He's claiming Halo now. That's special operations. That's not 82nd Line Infantry." Carl shook his head. "This guy's building a house of cards in a room full of people who know what cards look like." Dwight pushed back his chair. "I'm going to say something." Henry put a hand on his arm. "Wait." He nodded toward the end of the bar. They all looked. The old man had set down his bourbon. He was turning on his stool, slowly, the way a man turns when he has made a decision, and there is no hurry because the decision is final. The stool squeaked on the floor, a small sound, but in the sudden, anticipatory silence of the room, it carried. The regulars nearest to the bar had noticed the old man moving and had gone quiet, and that quietness had spread outward the way ripples spread on water, until the entire room had dropped to a murmur and then to nothing. The stranger, mid-sentence in his Halo story, faltered as he became aware that the atmosphere had changed. He looked around and found that most of the eyes in the room were no longer on him. They were on the old man at the end of the bar. The old man sat facing the stranger now, his cane between his knees, both hands resting on the carved parachute canopy handle. His posture was straight, the kind of straight that doesn't come from trying, but from a lifetime of standing in formations where anything less than straight was unacceptable. His sad, weary eyes were fixed on the stranger with an expression that was not angry, not aggressive, not confrontational. It was simply attentive, The way a man looks when he's about to ask a question that he already knows the answer to. "Son," the old man said. His voice was quiet. Not soft. Quiet. There is a difference. Soft implies gentleness. Quiet implies control. His voice was the kind of quiet that makes people stop talking and start listening, because it carries the unmistakable authority of a man who does not need volume to be heard. The stranger looked at him. For the first time since he had walked into the bar, his smile lost some of its wattage. "Yeah?" he said, and there was a slight defensive edge in his voice, the instinctive flinch of someone who senses that the ground beneath his story is about to shift. The old man looked at him steadily. He looked at the wings on the leather jacket. He looked at the angle they were pinned at. He looked back at the stranger's face. "You said you were 82nd Airborne. You said you made combat jumps." "That's right," the stranger said. His chin lifted, his jaw set. But his eyes were doing something his jaw couldn't control. They were moving, scanning, looking for exits, looking for allies, looking for any signal that the room was still on his side. It wasn't. The old man nodded slowly. Then he asked his question. "When you stood up in the aircraft and the jumpmaster gave the command, what was the first thing you did when you reached the door?" The question hung in the air like a parachute that hasn't opened. It was simple. It was specific. It was the kind of question that every single person who has ever completed a military static line parachute jump can answer without thinking, because the answer is not something you learn from a book or memorize from a manual. It is something that is drilled into your body through hundreds of repetitions until it becomes as automatic as breathing. A sequence of physical actions that you perform in the door of a moving aircraft at 1,200 feet above the ground, and that you will remember for the rest of your life because your life depended on performing them correctly. The answer involves handing off your static line to the safety, assuming a specific body position in the door, feet together at the edge, knees slightly bent, hands on the outside of the reserve parachute, eyes on the horizon, and then, on the command "Go," executing a vigorous exit by jumping up and out at a 45-degree angle, chin tucked to the chest, elbows tight to the body, counting 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, while waiting for the opening shock of the canopy. Every paratrooper knows this. It is the first thing they learn and the last thing they forget. It is the signature experience of the airborne, the moment that separates those who have jumped from those who have not. And if you have done it, even once, the question is so easy it barely qualifies as a question at all. The stranger stared at the old man. His mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. And what came out was not an answer. It was noise, a jumble of half-formed words that started with, "Well, you just," and then veered into, "I mean, you check your," and then collapsed into silence. He could not answer. He could not describe the door position because he had never been in one. He could not describe the exit because he had never made one. He could not produce the answer that every real paratrooper carries in their muscles and their memory, because the answer was not in any movie he had watched, or any book he had read, or any story he had stolen from someone else's life. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was full of the sound of 30 years of lies meeting one moment of truth. It was full of the sound of every real veteran in the room understanding, with absolute clarity, what had just happened. It was full of the sound of the stranger's fabricated identity collapsing under the weight of a single question from a quiet old man with a cane. The first person to stand was Frank Caruso. He pushed back his chair at the Friday board table and rose to his full height, 6'2", broad-shouldered, with a chest that still carried the mass of a man who'd been a first sergeant in a parachute infantry regiment for the better part of 3 decades. He did not say a word. He simply stood, and he looked at the stranger with an expression that contained no anger, no hatred, no violence, only a cold, absolute clarity. Carl Mackey stood next, then Dwight Odom, then Henry Ziegler. 4 men, 4 paratroopers, standing in a row beside their table like a formation that had been called without a command. Then Bill Kehoe, the retired infantry sergeant who had been sitting next to the stranger, stood up from his bar stool. He was not airborne qualified, but he was a veteran, and he understood what was happening. Then a man at a table near the door, mid-50s, wiry, with a faded Screaming Eagles tattoo on his forearm, and stood. Then another. Then another. Within 60 seconds, Every veteran in the room was on their feet, not shouting, not threatening, not moving toward the stranger, just standing. Standing the way soldiers stand when something has been violated and the violation has been witnessed, and the witnesses have decided without discussion that they will not let it pass in silence. The only people still seated were the two civilian fishermen, who looked terrified, and the old man at the end of the bar who had not moved from his stool. The stranger's face had gone through several colours in the past 90 seconds, from confident pink to uncertain white, to the particular shade of grey that comes when a man realises that the room he is in has turned against him, and there is no story clever enough to turn it back. He was gripping his glass with both hands. His eyes were darting from face to face, looking for sympathy and finding none. Darlene stood behind the bar with her arms crossed, her face set in the expression she reserved for moments when she was deciding whether to handle something herself or let the room handle it for her. She was letting the room handle it. Frank Caruso spoke first. His voice was calm, measured, and carried the kind of authority that does not come from rank, but from the earned respect of men who have followed you into situations where rank means nothing and character means everything. "I made 3 combat jumps," he said. "Grenada, Panama. I can describe the door of every aircraft I ever stood in. I can describe the wind. I can describe the sound. I can describe the face of the man who jumped before me and the face of the man who jumped after." He paused. "Can you?" The stranger said nothing. Carl Mackey spoke next. "I earned these wings at Fort Benning in 1979. Jump week. 5 jumps in 5 days. I threw up before every single one. I have never been more afraid of anything in my life, and I have never been more proud of anything either. Those wings," he pointed at the stranger's jacket, "are not a pin. They are a promise. A promise that you will go out that door when your country asks you to, no matter how scared you are, and you did not make that promise." The stranger's hand moved involuntarily toward the wings on his jacket, as if to cover them or protect them, and then dropped back to the glass. Dwight Odom stepped forward. 1 step, just 1, but it was enough to close the distance between the table and the bar by half. "Take them off," he said. His voice was quiet and absolutely steady. "Take them off your jacket, put them on the bar, and walk out of here. Nobody is going to stop you. Nobody is going to follow you. But you are not going to sit in this room, in front of these photographs." He gestured toward the wall without looking at it. "Wearing something you did not earn." The stranger looked at the wings on his jacket. He looked at the faces of the men standing around him. He looked at the photographs on the wall, the young men in fatigues, the paratroopers in drop zones, the formal portraits with their medals and their rigid postures, and their eyes that held things no photograph could fully capture. And something happened in his face that was difficult to watch, because it was the look of a man who's been caught so completely and so publicly that there is no narrative he can construct to escape it. His lip trembled, his eyes reddened, not with shame exactly, but with something adjacent to it, the particular anguish of a man who wanted so badly to be something he was not that he convinced himself the pretending was the same as the being. He reached up with unsteady fingers and unclipped the wings from his jacket. They came off with a small click and the sound of a clutch back releasing, and he set them on the bar. They sat there, bright and untarnished, looking exactly like what they were. A costume piece, never worn in service, never earned in the door of an aircraft, never tested by the wind and the fear and the weight of a full combat load at 1,200 feet. The stranger stood up. He did not look at anyone. He walked to the door, pushed it open, and stepped out into the parking lot. The door swung shut behind him. The room remained standing for a long moment. Then, one by one, the veterans sat down. The last to sit was Frank Caruso, who looked at the wings on the bar, picked them up, and set them on the shelf behind the photographs on the wall. Not displayed, not discarded, but placed in a spot where they could be seen by anyone who looked, as a reminder that the real thing and the imitation exist in the same world, and that the difference between them is everything. The room was quiet for several minutes after the stranger left. Not the uncomfortable quiet of a scene everyone wishes they hadn't witnessed, but the heavy, necessary quiet that follows a moment of collective truth-telling. Darlene refilled glasses without being asked. She moved along the bar with the practiced efficiency of someone who understands that sometimes the best thing a bartender can do is keep the drinks flowing and the conversation optional. Bill Kehoe was the first to speak. He turned on his stool and looked down the bar at the old man, who had returned to his bourbon and was sitting exactly as he had been sitting before. Cane between his knees, hands on the carved handle, eyes on his glass. "That question," Bill said. "The door question. How did you know that would do it?" The old man looked at him. "Because the door is the only part that matters," he said. "Everything else, the stories, the jargon, the names and dates, all of that can be learned from a book. But the door is physical. The door is in your body. If you've been there, you don't need to think about it. If you haven't, you can't fake it." Bill nodded slowly. "How many times have you been in the door?" The old man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Enough." It was Frank Caruso who walked over next. He brought his beer with him and stood beside the old man's stool, not sitting, not presuming to close the distance without invitation. "I know who you are," Frank said quietly. The old man looked at him. "I've seen your picture on the wall. 3rd row, 2nd from the right. You're younger in the picture, but the eyes are the same." He paused. "You jumped into Panama with us. Operation Just Cause, December 1989. H-hour." The old man nodded. It was a small nod, barely perceptible, and it carried the weight of a night that had shaped both of their lives in ways that no one who wasn't there could fully comprehend. Operation Just Cause, the United States invasion of Panama, had begun on the night of December 20th, 1989, with the largest combat parachute jump since World War II. Elements of the 75th Ranger Regiment and the 82nd Airborne Division had jumped into multiple objectives under fire, in darkness, in winds that exceeded safe limits, into drop zones that were compromised by enemy positions. It was the kind of operation that made paratroopers out of soldiers and legends out of paratroopers, and it had happened 36 years ago on a night that the men who survived it could still describe in a level of detail that would make a novelist weep. Frank pulled up a chair. "I was a buck sergeant that night. 504th PIR. We jumped onto Torrijos Tocumen at H-hour. I remember the tracers coming up through the canopy. Looked like fireflies." The old man smiled faintly, the kind of smile that only appears when someone says something that unlocks a memory you have been carrying alone. "I was on a different objective," he said, "but I saw the same fireflies." Frank looked at him. "What was your MOS?" The old man took a sip of his bourbon. "Started as 11 Bravo. Ended up doing things that didn't have a number." Frank nodded. In the military, things that didn't have a number was understood to mean special operations, classified assignments, or both. It was not a question that required a follow-up. "How many jumps?" Frank asked. The old man thought about it, not in the way of a man trying to remember, but in the way of a man deciding how much to say. "I stopped counting after 200, he said, "but I remember every door." By now, the Friday board had migrated from their table to the bar. Carl, Dwight, and Henry had pulled up chairs and formed a loose semicircle around the old man's corner, the way soldiers naturally form around a senior man when the situation calls for it. The 2 civilian fishermen, sensing that they were witnessing something private and important, had quietly moved to the pool table and were pretending to play a game while listening to every word. The old man did not usually talk this much. Darlene, who had known him for 11 years, later said it was more words than she had heard him speak in the entirety of those 11 years combined. But something about the evening, the stranger's lies, the room's response, the solidarity of men standing up for something that mattered, had opened a door in him that was usually closed. Not wide open, just cracked. Just enough to let a little light out. He told them about jump school at Fort Benning in 1969. The heat, the red Georgia clay, the black hats who seemed to exist for the sole purpose of making you question every decision you had ever made. He told them about his first jump from a C-119 flying boxcar, and how the opening shock had been so violent that he thought the parachute had torn and he was dead, and how the silence that followed, the sudden, absolute silence of a good canopy overhead and the earth below, was the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. He told them about jumping in Vietnam, in conditions that would have grounded any training jump in the States, into landing zones that were often nothing more than a cleared patch of jungle with hostiles on 3 sides. He told them about jumping in Panama on that December night in 1989, when the tracers came up through the darkness like bright red threads being pulled from the ground by an invisible hand. And he told them, very quietly, about the last jump he ever made, a night jump alone, into a place he could not name, for a purpose he could not describe, in a year he would not specify. He said only that the wind was wrong, that the landing was hard, that his left knee had never been the same, and that when he finally stood up in the darkness and oriented himself, the first thing he felt was not pain or fear but gratitude. Gratitude that the canopy had opened, that the ground had received him, and that he was still, after everything, a man who went out the door. The room was very quiet. Carl Mackie was looking at his hands. Dwight Odom was staring at the photographs on the wall. Henry Ziegler was nodding slowly, the way a man nods when he hears something that resonates with a frequency only certain people can hear. Frank Caruso was sitting perfectly still, his beer untouched, his eyes on the old man with an expression that combined respect, recognition, and a deep particular sadness that comes from knowing that the man in front of you has carried more than most men could bear, and carried it quietly and never asked for anything in return. The old man took a sip of his bourbon. "That man tonight," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the door where the stranger had exited. "I'm not angry at him." The table went quiet in a different way, surprised. "He wanted something he didn't have," the old man continued. "He wanted to belong to something bigger than himself. He wanted people to look at him the way they look at someone who has done something that matters. I understand that. Everybody wants that." He paused. "But you can't take it. You have to earn it. And the earning is the thing that changes you. The earning is the part that stays. Not the wings, not the stories. The earning." Frank nodded. "The earning," he repeated. "And the door," the old man said. He tapped the carved parachute handle of his cane. "Always the door." Darlene, who had been listening from behind the bar with a dish towel in her hand and something bright in the corner of her eye that she would have denied was a tear, set a fresh bourbon in front of the old man without being asked. "On the house," she said. He looked at her. "Darlene, you've never given me a free drink in 11 years. And I probably won't again," she said. "So enjoy it." He smiled. A real smile. The kind that reached his sad, weary eyes and made them, for just a moment, less weary. He raised the glass slightly and took a sip. At the pool table, one of the civilian fishermen leaned over to the other and whispered, "What just happened?" The other one shook his head. "I have no idea," he said, "but I'm never going to forget it." The evening continued. The heavy moments settled into something warmer, the way intense experiences do when they are shared among people who understand each other. The Friday board stayed at the bar with the old man, and the conversation shifted from the weight of the past to the lighter terrain of stories that soldiers tell when they are safe and among their own. Stories about terrible food in the field, impossible sergeants, gear malfunctions at the worst possible moments, and the particular absurdity of military bureaucracy that every person who has ever worn a uniform can relate to. The old man laughed at some of these stories, a quiet, dry laugh that sounded like it came from somewhere deep, and was surprised to find the exit. Carl Mackie told a story about a jumping grenadier, where his reserve chute deployed accidentally during the exit and wrapped around his legs, and he landed in a sugarcane field looking like a human tamail wrapped in army green. The room laughed. Even the old man laughed. It was, Darlene would later say, a Good Friday. At the end of the evening, as the regulars settled their tabs and moved toward the door, Frank Caruso stopped beside the old man's stool one final time. "You should come more than Fridays," he said. The old man considered this. "I'll think about it. We meet Wednesdays too, card night. The stakes are low and the lies are worse than that guy's." The old man smiled again. "I'm not much of a card player. Neither is Carl, and he shows up every week." Carl, who was pulling on his jacket near the door, called out, "I heard that." The room laughed. The old man stood up from his stool, steadied himself on his cane, and looked around the room, at the bar, at the photographs, at the men who were filing out into the night, at the spot on the shelf where the stranger's fake wings now sat behind the frames. He looked at it all with the expression of a man who has spent most of his life in rooms like this and knows that these rooms, imperfect, worn, held together by memory and duty and the particular bond of people who have done hard things together, are among the few places in the world where he does not need to explain who he is. He tapped his cane once on the floor, nodded to Darlene, and walked toward the door. His left knee was stiff, and the cane squeaked on the linoleum, and his faded dark red shirt was slightly wrinkled from an evening of sitting on a bar stool. But he walked the way paratroopers walk, straight, deliberate, with the unconscious posture of a man who has been falling through the sky and landing on his feet for longer than most people have been alive. At the door he paused. He turned back to look at the room one more time. The photographs on the wall, the flag in the corner, the empty stool where the stranger had been sitting, the shelf where the wings now rested. He nodded once, to the room, to the memories, to the men in the photographs who would never sit in this bar again, and then he pushed the door open and stepped out into the North Carolina night. The parking lot was dark except for the single floodlight illuminating the flag, which moved in a light breeze that carried the smell of pine and red clay. The old man walked to his truck, a modest sedan actually, dark blue, with a veteran's license plate that said nothing about branch or rank or unit, only that the driver had served. He opened the door, set his cane across the passenger seat, and lowered himself in with the careful movements of a man whose body has been used harder than it was designed for and is still, somehow, functioning. He started the engine. The headlights cut across the gravel lot and caught the front of the VFW building, the brick, the siding, the flag, the sign that read, VFW Post 4077, all gave some gave all. He looked at the sign for a moment. Then he put the car in gear and pulled out onto the two-lane road. In the rearview mirror, the floodlight on the flag grew smaller and smaller until it was just a point of light in the darkness, and then it was gone. But the room was still there, the photographs were still there, and the men who had stood up, the men who had risen from their chairs without being asked, without hesitating, without needing to discuss it, those men were still there too. They would be there next Friday. They would be there every Friday. Because that is what soldiers do. They stand up. If this story reminded you that real honor can't be faked, subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because in a world full of people pretending to be something they're not, we should never stop standing for the people who are the real thing.